Slavery might have been abolished centuries ago, but it remains a huge global problem. It affects 50 million people worldwide. So what can be done to help those who've become modern slaves? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Slavery doesn't look like what it did 200 years ago. Today, it's very often hidden, with victims reluctant to speak up. So, just what is modern slavery and why are so many denied basic freedom? Here's Roundtable's Jen Carswell with more on this.
When you think of slavery, you might be picturing images like these of the transatlantic slave trade, which was rampant from the 16th to the 19th century. But modern slavery has many forms. Broadly speaking, it happens through trickery, coercion, or by forcing a person to lose their freedom. It happens when an individual is exploited by others for personal or commercial gain. Of the nearly 50 million people living in modern slavery, 22 million are in forced marriages and nearly 28 million in forced labor. Some of the common forms of modern slavery are domestic servitude, human trafficking, and debt bondage. This last type is the most widespread and involves poor or vulnerable people going into debt and then being forced to pay it off. And the instances of debt bondage have grown significantly recently.
This 10 million person increase in the last 5 years has happened on a background of compounding crisis, be it the COVID-19 pandemic, the climate crisis, or protracted conflict throughout the world. We know that displaced populations and refugees are exceedingly vulnerable to modern slavery. We know that women and girls remain the most vulnerable to modern slavery.
It's possible that some of the clothes you buy or products on the shelves are the result of forced labor. Supply chains are very complex, and big businesses may not know they're exploiting vulnerable workers. Legislation in the UK makes large companies report on steps they're taking to tackle modern slavery in their supply chains. Many campaigners would like to see laws go even further, but with something that's intentionally kept hidden, it'll take businesses, consumers, governments, and individuals to play their part to help bring modern slavery to an end.
Let's meet our guests. In London is Shola Mos-Shogbamimu. She's a lawyer, women's rights activist, and author of This Is Why I Resist, Don't Define My Black Identity. Kevin Hyland is strategy director at the Santa Marta Group. That's a global alliance between the Catholic Church and law enforcement working to eradicate human trafficking. He's also the chair of the G20 Human Trafficking Interfaith Forum and was the UK's first independent anti-slavery commissioner. He joins us from Limerick in Ireland. Here in the studio with me, we have Emily Death. She is CEO of the Sophie Foundation, a charity helping women survivors of modern slavery rebuild their lives. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. Come to you first, Emily. Modern slavery, it's hidden, it's insidious, it's everywhere.
It absolutely is. It's a crime that's hidden in plain sight in our communities all around us. And I work at the Sophie Foundation, where we support women survivors of modern slavery and human trafficking. And I think women victims of slavery and trafficking find themselves in areas of exploitation which are even more hidden, places like sexual exploitation, domestic servitude, or forced marriage. And so then, of course, the identification for them and the support that they need to rebuild their lives is even harder to access.
It's hard to believe this is still going on in 2024.
It is. It's many people that we talk to every day think that slavery is consigned to the past, that it is a relic of the past. Not at all. In fact, the statistics show that it's a crime which is growing and also evolving as well, with new types of slavery and exploitation and forced criminal exploitation, for instance, becoming visible and growing here in the UK as well as overseas.
Shola, come to you. I mean, if you mention slavery to people, they would think this is something that was left centuries ago, something that we learn about in history in school, and yet it's still happening in today's world.
That's correct. And they would be very wrong to think that it's a thing of the past, because it's not. The way that modern day slavery works is that it basically has evolved with the times, and it has evolved with social mechanisms, economic mechanisms that exist today. It's absolutely insidious. So whether it is debt, bondage, it's forced labor or human trafficking, what we have is we have many people in different parts of the world being enslaved through circumstances beyond their control. And one of the reasons why this modern slavery has fostered is simply because we live in societies that basically don't see these people. They treat them like they don't exist. It's the same way you walk down the street and you walk past a homeless person. You could be walking past somebody who's enslaved right next to you, but people are not picking up on the signs. People are not looking. It could be in your neighborhood, in your schools, it could be in your workplace, but people are not, either they are too busy with their own lives or they are not aware of what to look out for. And the reality here is that we're talking about people being coerced. We're talking about people being forced or tricked into this bondage. And it is slavery. There's no other word for it but slavery.
Kevin, I read a report recently in one of the British newspapers, and it pointed out that the group in the UK most likely to be affected by modern slavery is teenage British boys being dragged into county lines drug running. What's your assessment of groups in the UK affected by this?
Yes, and that's a true fact. Last year in the UK, there were 17,000 referrals into the National Referral Mechanism, which is the government-run program for supporting victims of trafficking. And the largest cohort by a long way was British nationals and also young boys and girls who were being trafficked in the UK for forced criminality and for sexual exploitation. But that's not unique to the UK. This morning I was on a call with members of the African Union, and that's the same problem in Africa, in the US, and here where I am in the moment in Ireland. There's a big problem with gangs recruiting and using young people for criminal activities. So large organized gangs will use people, young people, and force them into criminality and act as their drug mules. And we need to remember that globally, there are 49.6 million people who are trafficked at the moment. That's an astonishing number. And the money that they're making for criminals is 236 billion, making it one of the biggest income generators for criminal activity. And yet the powers and the authorities and the resources to counter this don't even equate to even 1% of this. And figures show, which come from the US State Department and other international recognized ways of overseeing human trafficking, show that there's over a 99.98% chance of getting away with trafficking if you're a criminal. And your chances of being identified globally as a victim are about 0.5%. So it's almost the perfect crime to commit. And a lot of that is because, as we've heard from the previous two speakers, we don't see the victims, we don't identify them. In many countries, for example, the UK, even where a victim is identified, it takes them over 60 days to enter into what's called the National Referral Mechanism. And then it's taking, on average, 2 years for the authorities to make a decision that you are a trafficked person. Can you imagine that? If we went into a police station or we went into the authorities or we reported somehow that we were a victim of a serious crime that in the UK holds life imprisonment, and they said, we'll come back and let you know whether you're a victim in 2 years, there'd be outrage.
Kevin, just explain to us why criminal gangs are so intent on exploiting young people. What's the attraction there? Why are they going after teenagers to do their dirty work?
Well, it's because it puts distance between the criminal and the offence. And if, for example, as in the UK, you can recruit, hundreds of young people to move your drugs around, you put relatively small amounts in their possession. So if you lose it, it's not, a major loss, but it will be a significant loss. And if they're caught, they don't know what the network is, so they're caught with, say, £1,000 or £2,000 worth of drugs, and they will be dealt with as a young offender for possession of drugs, normally with intent to supply. But it's a safe way of doing it, and until law enforcement and the agencies are investigating back, then you've almost got perfect impunity. And of course, the way they recruit is in the most difficult areas of the UK and elsewhere in the world. They will see young people, and young people that I've met who are now grown up and were in those situations have told me that when they were 12 and 13 and they were going to school, maybe in a difficult part of London, they would go to school and they would just be in the community like any other child. When they got to 13, somebody on the estate or somebody in the community would then say, you're going to work for us and you're going to do this. And there was no option. And the risk to them and to their family was too great for them not to do it.
Shola wants to come in on that point. Shola.
I think that Kevin's just absolutely spot on in what he said. We also have to remember that one of the reasons they target children is because, or should I say kids, is because they're vulnerable, particularly kids that may or may not come from who are experiencing difficult situations. And they also use children to recruit children. So when I say children, I'm talking about teenagers, okay? So they use teenagers to recruit teenagers. They use the same type of language, promises, almost as though by befriending them, they're offering children some kind of emotional replacement to what they don't have at home or what they don't have amongst friends. That's for some kids. And some other kids may be threatened into it. They may be coerced into it, tricked into it. We have to remember that at that age, being teenagers, they're not at a stage where they can process the consequences of such actions. They're literally being led to the slaughterhouse to commit these crimes, and they do not understand what they're doing. They see what they're doing, but they don't necessarily understand what it is. And that is why they target children. And I think it's one of the saddest things that we live in a society where we don't have enough resources to support and help our children and protect them from these wolves, to protect them from people who want to exploit them for personal and commercial gain, because we know these people exist. We know the areas they like to tap into. None of this information is new. And just as Kevin said, how can a society take 2 years to identify and designate that a child is vulnerable, a child is a victim of trafficking, a victim of modern slavery? 2 years, that's unacceptable. We have to do so much better.
Emily, just give us an insight from your experience what life is like for a modern slave. For example, some of the women you've helped, rescued and got out of those situations.
Yes, typically the women who come into the programmes that Sophie Hayes Foundation supports have been those who've experienced sexual exploitation or domestic servitude, although we are also starting to see some women coming through who might have been exploited in the care sector here in the UK. I think that's a growing area of concern. The work that we do is a bit later down the journey to recovery, if you like. There are many organisations doing fantastic work as first responders to lift people out of those situations of exploitation. And then a bit further down the line, when they have had some more foundational support, they come to Sophie Hayes Foundation, where we work with them to support their long-term freedom from re-exploitation and to build skills and opportunities within communities for education and employment. But I think through their eyes and through their stories, we see the picture of a system which is unfortunately in a state of collapse, more or less. A lot of that foundational support, which is really necessary and also is set out in the intention of the Modern Slavery Act, is ever harder for them to access. So it's ever harder for them to progress along that journey towards true, sustained freedom. And also because there are many very well-intentioned but many sort of smaller charitable actors within this space, stepping into a space where the state is not necessarily providing anymore. It's a very bewildering patchwork of different services and different things that you can access as a survivor. So I think navigating the support that is out there is really one of the critical challenges, and policymakers need to see that from the perspective of the survivors themselves to understand what changes need to be made.
And the women themselves, tell me, do they understand that they're being treated as modern slaves, or are they in a situation where perhaps they owe a loyalty to the perpetrator? Just explain that to us.
Yeah, I think that can definitely be there. I mean, as the other speakers have said, we're talking about crimes here of manipulation and exploitation. So there's a huge range of feelings that might be caught up in that, of course, and recovery from that takes a long period of time. And I think especially some of the definitions which are inherent in the whole sector. So Kevin mentioned, for instance, the national referral mechanism. Within this bewildering system of support that a survivor might be able to access, they will be given terms like this, caseworker, national referral mechanism, without any context for what that means. And I think a lot of the work that we and other organisations to do is to try to help survivors to navigate that, because while the Modern Slavery Act sets out kind of the structure, the terms of modern slavery and human trafficking, which are really useful to us from an identification and a policy perspective, actually for those individuals within that experience, it really does contribute to the overall sense of sort of a bewildering cluster of support.
Shola, some people might say, you know, why don't these women run away? Why don't they go to the authorities? But the reality is, a lot of the time, the perpetrators will have taken their passports. They will be completely beholden to their abusers. That's the reality, isn't it?
I think that is a reality. And I would say to those who wish to confer an opinion on something that, something they know nothing about and they're not wearing those women's shoes, could they please kindly just be quiet? I'm just sick and tired of people telling those who are actually experiencing this absolute horrific experience that they could have done this or they could have done something better. No, they're in the situation they're in because we live in a society that has made this possible. And and for many of these women, they live in fear, for goodness sake. Sometimes, I've heard stories of some victims of modern slavery who have had, enough courage to find someone, report it, talk about it, and they're not believed. What more can we expect of the victims when we are not creating the right support? We are not putting people in the right place. We are not educating people so that when they see, they can identify the indicative factors. That's a society we live in. And some of these women may be walking straight past us on the street. We can't even identify the different things that may alert us that there is a case of modern slavery going on here. So no, I don't think we should be looking at the women and going, I'm sorry, you could have done this, you could have done that, because you do not know what their circumstances are. What we should be talking about is, what have we learned from the survivors of modern slavery? What is it that they've told us have made it really difficult for them, the obstacles in their ways, and how can we ensure these obstacles are removed so that those who are still experiencing modern slavery are going to have a clearer path to help, to support, and quite frankly, being rescued from the situation that they're in. I think that is what is clearly important. We cannot come at this from a position of, why didn't you? It should always be from a position of, how can we do more? What can we do? Because if we did not create the mess that we are in, they would not have to be where they are. It's a collective responsibility.
Kevin, what are the warning signs here? Educate us. What should we be looking out for?
Well, I think Shola and Emily have both spoken about the signs, and the fact is, these can be in our high streets, car washes, nail bars. We have, sexual exploitation with brothels all across the UK and globally. But I think some of the signs are there that are hidden even from the public, which are the signs which the authorities should be looking for. When I was working as the lead for human trafficking at Scotland Yard, one of the areas I brought in was working with airlines, but not just to engage with the cabin crew about identifying potential victims on aircraft, but also about flight manifests. Who is booking one-way flights for many women, and where are those flights being booked from? And then you actually have a lot of intelligence that comes from that. The intelligence gathering on the issue of human trafficking is shockingly poor. As I say, 17,000 cases reported last year through the national referral mechanism, and yet that information isn't used like it would be for other serious and organized crime. And if I take examples that I know of victims that have been missed, as we've heard from Emily and Shola there, I know of young children, young girls from Africa who were trafficked to the UK and then ended up in prison because they had false documents in an adult prison. Or the fact of a woman who was brought to the UK from India and sold 3 times and raped daily. She was not listened to and her case was not being responded to. Now, I managed to put those right. Or in Ireland, a serious case of trafficking where a Vietnamese woman was trafficked to rural County Clare and kept in a large mansion to grow cannabis. And then when it was raided by the Irish police on Garda Síochána, she was imprisoned for cannabis cultivation. But when I got involved and identified the fact that how could a non-English speaking woman who travels from Vietnam set up an organized crime element that had over €1 million worth of drugs in it and rent a big mansion on the banks of the Shannon? It was impossible. So she was actually released as a victim and was placed into support. And then the focus needs to be on who are the traffickers, who are the organized criminals. And that's something that we are forgetting. And we're putting so much onus on the victims. If we look at international figures, it is victims who are rescuing themselves. The whole idea of the Council of Europe Convention, which the UK is a signatory to and obliged by, and so are 47 other countries, but the UN Palermo Protocol, which covers all UN countries, is that they will proactively identify, support, give the measures to victims that they need, but then also proactively pursue the criminals. Because otherwise, if we don't pursue the criminals and stop this, and that doesn't just mean through traditional policing, it means about supply chain transparency, because hundreds of thousands and millions of people are trafficked across the world, making goods that end up in our high streets. And we've seen that in supermarkets across the United Kingdom and across the UK, across the world, where products we're using daily, including our mobile phones, including the fruit we eat, including the clothes we wear, are made by people in slavery across the world. And sometimes that includes things that come into the UK and other parts of the world that are purchased by governments in government procurement. So
Shola, I'll come to you in a second, Shola.
need to make sure that they are not paying for traffickers.
Thanks, Kevin. We know women and girls are disproportionately affected by modern slavery. They're trafficked into the sex industry, kept in servitude as domestic workers in private homes, forced to work in exploitative conditions in factories, and bonded into agricultural labour. According to the UN, 71% of modern slaves are women. 1 in 130 women and girls globally are victims of modern slavery. Shola, these statistics are shocking.
Oh God, beyond shocking. And the fact that they continue to increase is truly heartbreaking. And just think about what Kevin's just said. The fact that a woman who has been trafficked can end up being charged with the crime of her trafficker, it is absolutely staggering to me. And that tells me that our so-called enforcement, process and officers are not educated or equipped to deal with this. How can a woman who is bearing the brunt of the criminality be the perpetrator of the crime? That not only is it unacceptable, it's unforgivable. And I think that we also have to bear in mind that this could be one of the tactics that the traffickers use to threaten and coerce women from, coming out and boldly, courageously sharing that they're experiencing this or going to report them, because they will say to them, well, then you will also be, hung out. You will also be found, guilty for this crime. And they'll be able to set out examples, because there will actually be examples to say, this happened to this woman. And even amongst the women who are trafficked, they'll be able to say, this girl that was here, this is what happened to her. And that will immediately shut them up. They will not be able to, who will they go to? This is really difficult.
Shola, good points there. Emily, do you think we need maybe national education campaigns on this so that people can actually spot the signs if they're in a nail bar, if they're at a car wash, if they're in any of the environments we've discussed?
Yes, I think national education is really important. And I think there are signs that a growing new generation of sort of active citizens and consumers are actually really much more interested in where the products they buy and the services that they use, where those come from. So I think that there is something that we can do there. But I do also think that the policymakers, the politicians and parts of the media play a role here, because unfortunately, victims of slavery and trafficking, who, as Kevin and Shola mentioned, are often actually held as criminally responsible when they are in fact victims, are being conflated with a much broader sort of culture war, hostile rhetoric about migration in general, and conflated with, asylum topics. And the Prime Minister actually stated last year that if you come illegally to the United Kingdom, you will not be able to benefit from the protection of the UK's modern slavery provisions, which firstly, how that can be described as a benefit, I'm not sure, but also that very deliberately misunderstands that those people have been illegally brought into the country, and the Prime Minister, of course, knows that. So we can do as much education as we like, and we can reach out to positive, active consumers, and businesses definitely have a role to play. But when the Prime Minister is deliberately, and parts of the policymakers and media misleading people in that way, then it's really an uphill battle for us.
Kevin, Shola and Emily, thank you all so much for your insight. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable, TRT World. And if you like what you see, please do hit that subscribe button. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here on Roundtable, goodbye and thank you for watching.